Assalamu alaikum. Imagine waking up one day to find your entire way of life under threat, your home invaded, and your friends and family being killed indiscriminately in front of your eyes. You call out for help, hoping someone from around the world might hear you, but they never do. Your story is forgotten, erased from the world's consciousness. This may seem like some sort of dystopian novel, but for the people of East Timor, this was their harsh reality. East Timor was a Portuguese colony located just north of Australia. They were a vibrant community that lived outside of the global economic system. They spoke more than 30 different languages and had a population of 700,000 people. In 1975, as they were seeking independence, their upstairs neighbor Indonesia invaded, leading to a barbaric genocide. Soon, thousands of Timorese people began fleeing into the jungles. Indonesian forces started setting up receiving centers outside of the jungles, waiting for these Timorese to come out waving white flags, where they were instantly killed on sight. But their main strategy and weapon was starvation. By 1978, more than 200,000 Timorese had been killed, wiping out 25% of the population. Now, shockingly, this entire atrocity was backed by Western powers, most notably Canada, the US, and Britain. Even more shocking was that there was almost no media presence about this, media coverage about this. At first, there was some media coverage about the geopolitical aspects of the area. But once the invasion actually began in 1975, the media's silence was deafening. Now, at this exact same time, in 1975, there was another genocide taking place in Cambodia. See, the Khmer Rouge regime was committing a genocide against their own people. Now, this genocide was widely reported on in the media. In fact, coverage about Cambodia was 17 times higher than that of East Timor. This leads us to a critical question. Why was one genocide completely ignored while the other one was highlighted? Well, in order to understand this, we have to dig a little bit deeper. See, just south of East Timor is a deep water sea lane perfect for US submarines to pass through. There's also massive oil reserves there. So in the case of East Timor, it was actually more convenient for the US and its allies to hide what was going on in East Timor. In Cambodia, on the other hand, the Khmer Rouge regime who was committing the genocide in Cambodia were communists, regarded as one of the biggest global threats to Western interests at the time. So in the case of Cambodia, it was actually more convenient for the US and its allies to show what was happening in Cambodia. Now, although these events took place nearly 50 years ago, we're still seeing the same phenomenon take place to this very day. Right now, there's a genocide taking place in Gaza, where men, women, and children are being killed indiscriminately in front of our eyes. Even though this is the most documented genocide, the media is still censoring it and watering it down the way they did in East Timor. At the exact same time, Russia's war in Ukraine is being reported on without any censorship. This brings us to a critical realization. The narratives that are presented in the media are not always based on the inherent truth or inherent value of the story, but rather, they're often influenced by the interests and the agendas of those in power. To understand how our narratives are controlled, we turn to the 5 filters outlined by Noam Chomsky in his book, Manufacturing Consent. These 5 filters are ownership, advertising, sourcing, criticism, and the common enemy. The first filter is ownership. Media companies are owned by large corporations, sometimes owned by even larger conglomerates. In fact, according to Business Insider, 90% of our media is owned by just 6 companies. There are many wealthy individuals and families that also own a lot of our media. For example, the Murdoch family owns all of these media outlets. The Newhouse family owns Vogue, Vanity Fair, and The New Yorker, as well as 26 local magazines and newspapers throughout the US. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and John Henry, another billionaire, owns the Boston Globe. This concentration of ownership can lead to biased news, as each of these owners and corporations have their own economic, political, and personal interests in mind. For example, they might downplay certain stories that might affect their economic interests, or they might amplify certain stories that align with their own personal agenda. The second filter is advertising. See, media companies, like any company, have the main goal of maximizing profits. But there's an issue here. See, media costs way more than media companies, or rather, the media costs way more than audiences would ever be willing to pay for it. So what do media companies do? Well, they sell to advertisers. But what do they sell to advertisers? Well, they sell the audience, people like you and me. This leads to a conflict of interest. See, since media companies rely on advertisers to stay afloat, our news can often be influenced by the interests and agendas of their advertisers. For example, news outlets might avoid negative stories about their advertisers, or they might even amplify certain stories that show their advertisers in a positive light. Ultimately, this compromises the integrity and the independence of the media as a whole. The third filter is sourcing. In order to understand this filter, I need to take you back 20 years and introduce you to my best pal. The early 2000s were a time full of uncertainty and fear. It was during this time that the Bush administration started saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Claims that we now know are blatant lies. But the media pretty soon started picking up on this, and the media played a crucial role in amplifying the administration's misleading message. This example shows how the media can become complicit in advancing the agendas of those in power. But that's not an accident. In fact, the system has been designed to be that way. See, our sources come from powerful entities like governments, corporations, and large institutions. They control the flow and the framing of our news sources. If you're a media corporation or a journalist and you try to scrutinize these sources, you're met with a limitation on access to media sources. If you don't have access to news sources, well, then you can't write the news. This fosters a system of complicity between the media and those in power. In essence, as a result, those in power decide what makes the news, who the experts are, and make themselves central to the process of journalism. In essence, those in power set the agenda for our journalism, limiting its very ability to hold those in power accountable. But what happens when you do criticize these sources? Well, you're met with our fourth filter, criticism. Whenever those in power do not agree with a certain media narrative, they try to discredit the people that go against their views. A great example of this is that of Julian Assange. He leaked top secret US documents that showed that the US was committing war crimes in the Middle East. He was on the run for nearly a decade before being arrested and serving 5 years in prison. He was only just released from prison 2 months ago. Another great example of this is that of Edward Snowden. He released top secret NSA documents that showed that the US was spying on millions of people from around the world. He had to flee to Russia, where he still lives to this very day. Both of these examples show how those in power will use criticism and legal threats to go against those who don't agree with them. The fifth and final filter is the common enemy. Back in the day, it was communism. Today, it is Islam, terrorism, and immigration. Those in power use the common enemy to silence those that are critical of the elite. By looking at these 5 filters, we come to the realization that the narratives that are fed to us are meticulously crafted to serve the interests of those in power. So you're probably thinking, what do we do about it? One thing we can do is to use media bias charts. The one that I recommend is called ad fontes, which literally means back to the sources. It shows both political bias on the right and the left, and it also shows reliability. The higher up you go, the more reliable your sources are. The lower down you go, the less reliable your sources are. We want to try to look for sources that are in this area, sources that are both reliable but have little political bias. But even when you find more reliable sources, the information that we receive can still be filtered and skewed. That's why it's important for us to continually question narratives, think critically, and challenge the status quo to see through media bias. As our brothers and sisters are going through a genocide in Gaza, as I speak, we must not lower our voices. We cannot let what happened in East Timor happen again. Let us be the generation that refuses to back down. For when we rise above the silence and confront the narratives of power with integrity and grace, we honor the voices of those that have been silenced and ensure that truth and justice take their place. Thank you.